Hello, and welcome everyone to de Gruyter Mouton's webinar called Documenting Indigenous Languages, a conversation about writing, publishing, and working with grammars. We have a fairly large audience today, comprised of professors, librarians, students, and independent scholars and researchers from around the world. And thank you all for joining our discussion. My name is Todd Bludeau. I'm a member of de Gruyter's Boston-based team and the moderator for today's webinar. You may also hear the voice of my colleague Ann Williams in the background in the event there are any technical issues, and we hope there will not be. We are very fortunate to have a distinguished panel joining us, but before I introduce them, I'd like to give you some brief housekeeping notes. We are looking forward to a lively and freewheeling discussion and exchange of opinions with everyone in attendance. At any time during the webinar, please feel free to ask questions in the chat. We will set aside the final 10 to 15 minutes to address them all. And one more thing is that this webinar will be recorded. A link to the recording will be subsequently sent to everyone who registered for the webinar. Now, please let me introduce our panelists in alphabetical order, beginning with Patience Epps, followed by Susan Gehr, Balam Mateo Toledo, Birgit Sievert, and Roberto Zariquiey. So Patty, please start with introduction. Just a briefly, please, your academic affiliation and your research topics and main areas of interest. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everyone, or hello, wherever you are. So I'm a professor of linguistics at the University of Texas at Austin, where I've been since 2006. And I work with Amazonian indigenous languages, and my primary focus involves the documentation and description of languages of the Nadahoop family of Northwest Brazil. So a lot of my work has involved the Hoop language, including writing a grammar, published with Mouton, in fact. And more recently, I've been working on Hoop sister languages, Doe and Nadab as well.
Great, thank you. Susan?
Good morning,
Susan,
so I am currently a librarian at the College of the Redwoods in Eureka, California. I also am a second language learner of Karuk. My main master teacher was Violet Super, and I also have worked on my language, which is the Karuk language, for many years, co-published a dictionary, and I'm very interested in lexicography and language revitalization.
Great, thank you, Susan. Balam, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Balam Mateo Toledo. I work at CIESAS in Mexico. I work on language description and documentation with focus on Mayan languages, especially in Anjobal in Ahuacatec, and which I'm also a native speaker of Anjobal. And I also work on community projects that focuses on training native speakers and teaching grammars to speakers of these languages that I work on. Thank you.
Thank you, Balam. Birgit, please.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Birgit Sievert from de Gruyter Mouton. I'm a linguist by training. I've worked with de Gruyter for 20 years now. De Gruyter Mouton started publishing in linguistics in the 1950s, and when Mouton started, we focused on Slavic languages in the first place. But nowadays, obviously, we have no restrictions whatsoever on the regions of the languages or of the language families, really. So I'd like to mention specifically the Mouton Grammar Library series, the one that Patty mentioned previously. They published comprehensive grammars, and they started in 1985, but we also publish grammars that are sketch grammars, so part grammars, really. And I very much look forward to our conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Birgit. And finally now, Roberto. Please.
Hi, my name is Roberto Zariquiey. I am a Peruvian linguist working in Peru. So I'm an associate professor at the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú. And I am devoted to the documentation and description of Peruvian languages, mainly Panoan languages, mainly Cacataibo and Isconagua and Amahuaca. And yeah, so I am also interested in language documentation and revitalization. And currently we are working on Chana, which is a interdisciplinary enterprise trying to develop language technologies for minority languages in Peru.
Okay, thank you, Roberto. We have prepared some questions and topics for everyone to think about and discuss. I'm just going to read the first one because it's fairly long. And it is, language documentation and grammar writing initiatives can bring together a range of people with various interests, training, and goals. Some of these people are frequently described as the community of speakers and/or heritage speakers. So when we talk about what it takes to make language documentation accessible and useful for the community, what is meant by community? And this is anyone for the panel to weigh in on.
From my perspective, I can tell you about my two main fieldwork experiences. So my first long-term fieldwork experience was with the Cacataibo people. And there was a clear community of speakers because you arrive to a village and you have a language which is being transmitted and used by children, parents, and grandparents. So when you have something like this, it's very easy to identify a community. Villages are organized into larger political organizations, and then everything becomes clear. But in my second long-term fieldwork experience with the Isconagua people, it was very difficult for me to identify the community because there were only 5 native speakers of the language living in different villages, mainly Shipibo villages, very far from each other. And when we started to work, we had to put all of them together in a single place, and we got the visit of their descendants, sons, children, grandchildren, and so on. And something interesting about this situation is that, in my mind, Isconagua, through the years, passed from being a language with 5 speakers to become a language with 112 speakers, including Semai speakers, Neo speakers, learners, and so on. So for me, now I have a broader definition of community, which should include all the people compromise with the language independently of their knowledge of the language or their ability to speak it fluently. So if you have descendants, if you have people who want to learn the language, who has blood from the last speakers, so then I would now prefer a broader definition of community.
Anyone else care to join in?
Yeah, I guess another situation that we have to probably have to think based on my experience, obviously, when we talk about community, sometimes the community can be defined in a very precise way in some cases, but in other cases, at least in my experience in Latin America, communities are very heterogeneous. They have people often, I mean, the community of speakers of a language, they often organize themselves in terms of needs, interests, religion, organization. So there is different ways of talking about community. Sometimes maybe a small set of people are not interested in the language, but other people are interested. So there is this really issue in terms of who is interested in terms of the language, in terms of who are not interested. So there are different ways of organization that we have to take into account. And when we say that we are really focused on how to make grammars accessible to speakers, there is an issue that we have to take into account. we are really talking about a small set of the people in the community. At least in Latin America, not everyone will be using a grammar, not everyone will be interested in that aspect. We're really talking about a set of communities, may involve teachers, maybe translators, students. So we're really maybe talking about this small group of people. In the case, for example, of Ahobal, I can think maybe, I mean, there are 200,000 speakers, but when we say that a grammar should be accessible to speakers, maybe we're talking about maybe 5,000 people that will be using that grammar. So that's sort of the community that we're sort of thinking about in general. So that's what I would say about this, the idea of community. So it's really the whole set of users will be sort of reduced in a sense. We're talking about a small group of people, really.
Okay. You know, I'm going to go right to the next question because it is somewhat related to this, what we've been talking about, community. And that is, can grammars serve different audiences at the same time?
So I can respond to this one. I know everybody has something to say here, but I would just point out that just as we've been discussing community as being really multifaceted, audience in general can be really multifaceted too. And there's really a whole range of what grammars can be, and it's not necessary to decide on just one particular grammar or one version of a grammar as meeting everybody's needs. You can create multiple versions of a grammar for different audiences, and the different versions can inform each other as well and build off each other. So there's some really nice examples out there of at least one or two that I can think of grammars that really try to reach a very broad audience. So an example is a PhD thesis by Daniel Wickeleyler-Smith here in our department at UT Austin, who wrote a grammar of the Kuna language, which is his own heritage language. And the grammar was pitched both for an academic audience, but also for a community audience, where he was explaining terminology and so on. And in that case, he did a really wonderful job, and it was a really quite successful effort. But at the same time, I think that one runs a risk if one tries to reach too large an audience with one single product, of effectively not fully reaching any of them. So that's a kind of tension that has to be navigated. And it's certainly true as well for descriptive grammars that aim for more comprehensiveness or interdisciplinarity, such as by including information that goes beyond synchronic linguistic description, like diachronic insights and cultural context. That again, there's one argument for reaching this broad audience, but another argument for targeting. And I think it's just important to think of different kinds of grammars as potentially different stages in a process, so that a reference grammar and pedagogical grammars can build on each other. There's no prerequisite that one come before another, but they can each be derivative of the other. And they may in fact be framed in different languages depending on what audience they're trying to reach. So for example, one might write a reference grammar in English, as I did with Hoop, but as in my case, I'm currently working on a community-oriented grammar in Portuguese that will be accessible to some community members who speak Portuguese, and then other people based in Brazil who might not be familiar or fluent in English. And it's also worth pointing out that developing a grammar and different versions of a grammar can involve these really deeply community-based initiatives. So a really nice example is work by Luisa Moral, who's been pioneering methods for producing really accessible and relevant grammatical materials through collaborative community workshops based in communities in Latin America primarily. And finally, just to point out that grammars can be adapted or drawn on for particular pedagogical goals as well. So there's some nice examples of entry-level linguistics textbooks for particular audiences that draw on examples and analyses that come from a relevant set of grammars. So for example, an introductory linguistics textbook for speakers of Mayan languages by Nora England that draws on material from a range of grammars relating to those languages. and currently work by Gladys Camacho Rios and colleagues, where she's editing introductory linguistics textbook that's designed for a Bolivian audience that's drawing on grammatical descriptions of different Bolivian indigenous languages. So there's really a range of possibilities.
Okay, thank you, Patty. Anyone else among the panelists care to add a comment?
Sure, I'll just say briefly that where there is just, you know, one grammar that language communities can adapt. One strategy that we used in Karuk was just asking newer learners to look at the examples. Don't worry about the linguistic descriptions, just look at the examples and you know, do your work based off of that.
Okay.
So, can I say something about that?
Yes.
Okay, I think there is an experience in Guatemala where OCMA, which is an organization that used to work, but it's closed now. It's no longer doing research, but it was an organization that did research on Mayan languages, and sort of the users of those, the results of those research in Guatemala were mostly teachers, and in some of those cases, teachers complain about the grammars, that they were too technical. They were too technical. They lacked definitions, and the terminology is too complex. So I mean, it's just that sort of really, they were saying, okay, this is linguistic work is not really easy to use for teaching purposes, right? So. And so that's a lot of people complain about that kind of work. So and then at OCMA, sort of there was an initiative to sort of to do research at the same time and do it in the same technical academic way that you would do it, with some adaptations of maybe putting more cases of definitions and being careful in terms of how you present the data so that it would be accessible, for example. Sometimes the speakers don't really need the glosses, all the glosses that one often puts in a grammar. So there are ways of, so in OCMA, basically the research was kind of done adapting some of those things so that the grammar would be accessible. But the other way that it was approached is that basically there was a research going on, and after you do the research, you publish the results, and then you produce another version of that research, really an adapted version where it basically is, let's say you produce a grammar, then you make a pedagogical grammar, you produce a set of text collection with glosses, you produce maybe reading books. And so those are the sort of way that sort of people try to sort of produce two products at the same time, really one for academic, purely academic purposes, and one adapted version for the people, for the community. So that's one way that OCMA, at least, they approach that kind of question. And I think also the work of Nora England also tried to write a introduction to the grammar of Mayan languages based on all the research that was done at OCMA. And the way she did it is basically, she surprised basically all technical terms and didn't put glosses in. So just explain the phenomena with the same level of, high level of explanation, but with the information, taking out the information that you don't need for the speakers. So I don't know if that, how that grammar is being used now, if that has an impact and whether it's more accessible. I don't know really what the result is, but there is an intent of trying to make this accessible.
Thank you, Balam. Roberto, did you want to say anything, or Birgit?
Yes, very briefly. So I basically agree with Patty and Balam. So thinking of a grammar for a very wide audience is a very difficult task. And the idea is that you, in the end, what you get is different types of products. So you get a grammar for linguists, and you get a grammar for speakers, which in Peru are often called pedagogical grammars. But there are a couple of problems there, at least in Peru. The issue is that if you want to be promoted at the university, if you want to get points and promotions and even money in your salary, you need to publish some specific type of academic product. So you need to publish in some specific editorial houses and in English, and you get a lot of motivation and support to get that kind of publications done. But on the other hand, you don't get any support or very little support. I shouldn't say nothing, but very little support for more social or community-based products and grammars. And the issue with this is that, okay, you write a grammar. So for example, I translate my Cacataibo grammar, which was written in English into Spanish, and I simplify this, and then I get a book with trying to transform it into a clearly more simple grammatical document. But I don't know if this will be useful. So you need to work with the speakers, and you need to train the speakers in how to use this grammar. And for that, you need a project. And those kind of projects are often more difficult to get than the academic ones. So I do feel this kind of contradiction. So you get a lot of pressure from your university, because the universities want to get higher in the rankings, and for that you need to get academic publications. And my feeling is that more social or community-based publications are a little bit out of the equation. And in countries like Peru, where we have 48 official languages, and 8 of those have less than 10 speakers, so it's a bit contradictory. So and it's very difficult to get support or help from the university or financial organizations to conduct this kind of research of work. So my feeling is that it is true that there are different kinds of grammar-related products, and at least in my experience, it is also true that there is some overall or general preference for the more academic ones. That you in the end are in some way encouraged to focus on those kind of publications, because then you will get promotions, you will become a full professor, you will get a better CV and so on. And this is something that should change, at least, time to time, slowly, but we need to be aware of that difference and try to promote the other kind of production, and try to get this kind of production into the ranking, so the universities get some kind of excitement about them and promote them from their own perspective.
Okay, thank you, Roberto. Let me just move on because of time. So this next question is actually for Susan, our librarian, and I'm sure a lot of librarians in the audience will have opinions about this as well. But so Susan, how often do you buy grammars for your library, and how are collection policies and purchasing decisions made more generally in libraries? If you could address that one, please.
Sure. So College of the Redwoods is a small community college. We don't buy, very many grammars at all. So, and the ones that we do are for languages that are languages of instruction here. So recently we had a Yurok language class, and the languages, indigenous languages we would tend to teach are the ones that are local to this area. And there's several of them. It's a pretty diverse area. That said, each college, most college libraries, or all of them, I'd like to generalize, is that we have a collections development policy that basically addresses, what we will buy, and that tends to be things that are of use to staff and students, faculty, and staff. We take requests from faculty. We fulfill them when we have the budget to do so. And larger research universities will not only have a general collections development policy, but they'll even have a discipline-specific academic policy. Like this week, I looked at policies from, Kansas, and I think Penn had a linguistics department specific policy. We librarians, well, I'll speak generally, we like it when faculty will tell us what they're looking for or hoping to get, and those policies and purchasing decisions are always better when there's feedback from universities. And I'd be interested in hearing what librarians at larger universities do with their purchasing decisions.
Great, thank you, Susan. And the next question is for a publisher, and that goes to Birgit. And the question is, what kind of resource can or will a publisher publish? Birgit, you're on mute.
Okay, I wanted to respond a little bit to what Roberto said about language of publication, because that's certainly something we start addressing more and more, because people who submit materials to us, they raise that issue again and again, accessibility for the communities concerned. And at the moment, Mouton, of which I'm director, we publish in English only, but at the Gruyter, we have an entire department focusing on Romance languages in philological terms, and they start publishing in Spanish, so, and also in other languages. So what I want to say is, don't be shy. Mention that you would prefer a different language of publication, okay, to everyone listening. That's certainly something we are open to explore. So that's one point. You asked me about the kind of resource the Gruyter would publish. When we talked in preparation for this meeting, I was saying we don't have restrictions on the kind of language community we look at. So the grammars we talk about, they might describe or focus on a community that is very, very small or very, very large. It doesn't matter. That's not a criterion for Mouton to decide whether to take on a project or not. So we're very open-minded in terms of what community we're looking at. I also wanted to mention that, of course, thinking about communities, thinking about the heritage speakers themselves, we more and more recognize the roles of the speakers also on the covers of the books. Not only the linguists who write the grammars, they not only thank the speakers and the prefaces, but they are also acknowledged in new ways on the publications. Yeah, and certainly it's not only in print that we publish. So I think that's also something that needs to be mentioned here. And I saw that someone in the chat was actually asking that, do you also publish in digital format? And there's a strong yes here. We publish always, both in print and in digital format. So that's always a given. I think that's about all I wanted to say. Yeah. Oh, perhaps one issue: pedagogical materials, as Roberto was saying, they are very different in comparison to academic publications. I repeat what others have said before me. So far, I mean, it's very difficult to reach that market. And to Gruyter, as it is positioned at the moment, we don't reach those markets easily. So it's always an issue that that linguists who want to publish grammars with us ask us, how do I reach the communities if I want to revitalize a language, for instance? And then we see on a case-by-case basis what we can do. For instance, we have many cases where we do paperbacks and we find solutions that are specific for the grammar itself. So, and that perhaps to just give you an idea of the scope, we publish about 10 grammars a year out of 80 book publications. So it's, yeah, that's about the range, right? And it takes, I mean, you probably all know this, some people write on a grammar through all their lives. They go to the same speech community every summer or winter. They dedicate a large section of their lives to immersing themselves, and then writing that grammar takes a long time. Some people write many various grammars on various languages. So we've seen all of that, right? People submitting and being ready after half a year, and people submitting and taking a decade. So we are, again, very, very open-minded there to have those relationships for a long time.
Okay, thanks, Birgit. The next question, I think we've actually kind of answered it already, but it is talking about technologies again. And the question is, which technologies can we use to make language documentation accessible both for present and future audiences? And of course, we've spoken about the digital format of the grammars we publish, but if anyone else wants to add anything, please jump in.
I wonder if maybe Roberto, would you like to address this one? You also had a point that was relevant to one of the previous questions that might be worked in as about just some of the difficulties of getting published grammars and other, and that in Peru, for example, and that relates to questions of alternative formats.
Well, actually, one of the lines in which we are currently working in Peru is with my group is in the development of language materials, technological language technologies for minority languages in here. And we kind of developed a sort of idea of what should be the ideal situation for this. And for example, from our perspective, there are a few things that language technologists need to develop further natural language processing tools for minority languages. And those are a tree bank using universal dependencies, a database following universal morphology, parallel corpora, and that's all. So basically all. So my feeling right now is that language documentation is using a lot of technology. We all use technology, and we have our schemes in which we go to the field, we transcribe, we use ELAN, then we gloss, and then we archive everything into an archive, a linguistic archive. But it would be great if we could at least incorporate some of these requested materials from the technology side. So for example, from the 2 hours, 4 hours, 10 hours, 100 hours of recordings, please annotate 100 sentences, 200 sentences in universal dependencies. Universal dependencies, by the way, doesn't have anything to do with generative nothing. It's a lexicalized, very typological approach to language. So the use of universal shouldn't scare linguists who work in a different perspective. So you get 200 sentences following that. You annotate 500 or 1,000 words following universal morphology. And this is something that will take, a month or maybe 2 months. And it do have a lot of impact in the development of language technologies. So like translators, spell checkers, and automatic morphological analyzers, automatic syntactic analyzers. And this is the kind of things that we are trying to promote in collaboration with the communities, because in Peru, there is a single bilingual teacher, indigenous bilingual teacher, who doesn't own a mobile smartphone. So, well, maybe a few, but in principle, you get a lot of access from speakers to the internet in cities, even in some villages. In many of the villages I work on, there is now internet connection. So it's amazing how the situation has changed in the last 5 or 10 years. So this is something that we are actually promoting and trying to make people more conscious about this. And and it's a matter of incorporating these approaches to the core of language documentation. And I think that this will have a great impact in the development of technologies for minority languages. And of course, grammars are important, because for minority languages, you don't have a lot of data on the internet. You don't have a lot of corpora. You don't have a lot. So all the approaches based on frequencies, all the approaches based on statistical approaches won't work for a minority languages. A minority language. You will need rules, and those rules can be extracted, produced from grammars. So this is what we are trying to develop for Peruvian languages, an approach in which people go to the field, do linguistic work of the traditional way, put things in archives as we all do, but at the same time leave the seed for future technological developments. And the impact for the maintenance and revitalization of indigenous languages that technologies might have, it's apparently high. We don't know, we haven't tested this thing in a large scale, but my impression is that they might help languages to survive, to stay awake.
Okay, thank you, Roberto. We have less than 10 minutes left before we get to our questions. And we have quite a few comments and questions in the chat area. So I'm going to skip to the final question, and we'll try and stop at around 12:45 so we can get to everyone's comments. So the final question I have for the panel is, how do grammars document variation in conversations, narratives, and other discourse forms? How do they engage with registers, styles, and even dialects? Does anyone want to tackle that one?
Oh, Roberto, do you want to begin?
Well, very briefly, just that something that I discovered, in the last years is that what I did when I was writing the grammar of Cacataibo was describing the language of 5 or 10 male speakers of the language, and all very, old. So yeah, so the difference between generations, the variation is a main is a main feature of language development and social use. And I do think that there is at least from the grammaticographic perspective, in terms of Lehmann, for example, or Mosel, there is no much space for variation. And I think that variation is crucial for understanding language dynamics and language development and so on. So in my perspective, I do think that variation should be a main issue in linguistics and in language description. So this idea of Labov, of social grammars, or the approach that people working on pidgins had for the description of pidgins, focusing specifically in variation might enrich our approach to language description and documentation. And there is a lot of things going on from the documentation and description perspective as well in the last 10 years or so. It's becoming an important topic.
Yeah, I would add that there are a few examples out there of some really impressive grammatical works that have really engaged with variation in a really comprehensive way. So for example, Nick Evans authored a pan-dialectal grammar of Benin-Yugunwok in Australia. That said, I think that it's a very real consideration that, again, just like balancing the different kinds of products and audiences, one also has to balance how much can you cover in one grammar, and how do you fit it all in, and how do you make it coherent? And another related point that comes up is just how to navigate speakers' perceptions of variation and their recognition or understanding of what kinds of variation are more appropriate to highlight. Sometimes communities don't always agree on what the kind of best version of a language to represent in a publication would be. And I think those can present some challenges. I know, Susan, you pointed out that in the Karo community, you have something like 5 different orthographies. So that's a sort of other level of variation, right? Susan, you're muted.
Thank you. And yes, we do have at least 5 roaming around, and people are very passionate about the ones that they learned on. And so when I was thinking of how do you represent variations, it's like with great empathy and realizing that the people who you might be thinking of, there's a variation. It's like, no, that's how they speak and how they do grammar in the language.
Okay. Well, we have 19 minutes left, and I think let's devote that to the chat room. We already have 41 comments in there from what I've seen. And
can I say something on this issue of variation?
Oh, sorry, Bala.
Just one quick thought about it. And in Mayan languages, there is a focus now on documenting variation, at least in the lexicon and in terms of dictionary. So the way people are addressing this question now is that they are we are trying to creating, there's several projects going on in terms of documenting variation in terms of the dictionaries. They include variation, variation in forms, in meaning, in different ways of how the language varies. And so, and those are being put into dictionaries, and there are also a project on creating linguistic atlases where you sort of map those variations. And so there are 4 versions of those that are available on the web now. And this is sort of an interesting topic because it requires, when you look at the paper, the printed form, it's not really, it's difficult to manipulate the information, but when you look at the digital formats, it's much easier. You can ask variation in terms of communities, in terms of meaning, in terms of forms. So you can sort of sort the variation in different ways, and digital formats are really useful for when you are documenting variation in terms of dictionaries. And I think those are very interesting. I mean, there are interesting ways of, it's much easier to sort of see the variation when you have digital formats because you can sort it in different ways. And that is I think it's where digital the technology is going to be very helpful, I think, in this aspect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Balam. Okay, so we have a little more than 50 minutes available. So I think we should jump right into the chat room and try and pick up on as many of these as we can. Don't know if we'll be able to get to them all, but if not, we'll try to address everyone's questions or comments, by email or so that they're all addressed. So let's just go quickly through them. So someone who's a researcher of the Guarani language in Brazil.
Todd, can I suggest?
Yeah, do you want to do that, Patty? Do you want to take over the chat?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was noticing there are a few questions that are really interconnected and also really link very much into some of the things we've just been talking about. So one in particular that I thought would be a good place to start, particularly based on what Balam was just talking about. Let's see, so Dorothee Berman Helen raised the question about how grammars kind of intersect with dictionaries. And I think this is part of a broader question, which is how grammars really fit in and work with a range of other materials resulting from language documentation. So dictionaries, but also, text corpora and things like that. And I don't know, Balama, you had some thoughts, I think, about how grammars and dictionaries and vocabulary, lexical work can intersect. And maybe you would like to talk about that.
I don't know if I have a specific, I don't know if I have a specific thought about it, but we are working on a project now where we are trying to document, basically, we're talking about documenting the lexicon of the language, focused on really the context. And we're trying to develop an idea where we basically will put a corpus, a dictionary based on corpus. And the idea is that those will be, I don't know, we still haven't talked to someone who does, all the work on technology, but the idea is that we would put all the dictionary will be connected to text, so that you would have the examples directly from the text. So it should be they should be linked, and then you could search for a word, and then you could get the database. And we are still trying to create the model of how to do it and focus on specific areas. But that is, I think, based on the talks that I have had with other people working on technology, that should be possible. It should be easier, because basically you have the dictionary should have access to a lexicon, and I think that would be, someone said that it shouldn't be there, but very difficult, but it could take some work in terms of doing the whole process, really creating the connection.
Susan, you've worked on a dictionary. Do you want to comment on that?
Let's see here. What could I say about that? I would say that, the dictionary is a lot of times the place where language community members will start. And, we've used our latest edition of our dictionary to maybe define some things that were in Bright's book, and checking them out with the community. So we would take things that we wanted to define in the front matter of the dictionary, grammatical features that we wanted to define, and take them to the language community to test out our definition and see how community friendly it was. And not only would we get input on that area, but they were catching errors in our examples. They were catching all kinds of things and really made it a better work. So community authorship really helped us out in that regard. And the dictionary project, the online dictionary project, that Berkeley has really taken the lead on. We've gotten a lot of text analysis out of that, so new understandings coming out of there.
I would add that it's just really important to highlight the synergy between these different areas of language documentation. A really nice example that comes to mind is my colleagues Lev Michael and Christine Beyer at Berkeley, who've been working on the Akito language in collaboration with the Akito community. And they have just completed recently a dictionary of Akito in English, a companion publication in Akito in Spanish, including a component that's in Loreto Spanish, which is the regional Spanish, and they're currently in the middle of working on the grammar. And clearly all of these projects are very, very interrelated, and they really feed on each other. Many dictionaries, of course, also include a grammar sketch. They include morphology in the dictionary itself that's relevant to grammatical analysis. So they really fit together. And there's also, I think it's also worth just pointing out some of the really interesting, fairly recent work that has been that's been done to help to integrate a grammatical description and a corpus that's ideally in an archive. And so, for example, Nick Thieberger, who's currently at the University of Melbourne and the director of the Paradisic Archive, did some really pioneering work on this, on the approach of just, as he called it, embedding a grammar in data, or producing a grammar embedded in data, where he really kind of thought through the process of putting very, very explicit citations for each example that take you to a precise point in an archived corpus. Martin Kohlberger in his Grammar of Chihuahua, which is a Chicham language of Ecuador, applied aspects of Thieberger's approach as well in really making his grammar embedded in data, and also included clickable sound files for each of the examples that were embedded in the PDF version of the grammar, which was his dissertation. So that's another, I think, really nice example of really creating this connection and leveraging this connection between archived texts and grammatical description.
And also, well, in coming back to dictionaries, my own experience is that speakers of indigenous languages of Peru valorate much more a dictionary than a grammar. So they know what to do with a dictionary, and they like grammars as objects, but they don't actually know what to do with a grammar. So dictionaries are you know, much more valued from the perspective of the community. But if we come back to the universities, then, you know, if a student of mine wants to get a master's degree with a dictionary, she or he won't be able to do it because it's not academic enough, it's not scientific enough. What is the science there? What is the theory there? And you know, it's just it's a narrow, as Spike said, it's a very narrow, in the chat, it's a very narrow approach to what is academically valuable. And I have the feeling that dictionaries are discriminated in the universities, but it's the other way around from the perspective of the communities. And of course, you know, in Canada or in California, you might get different situations. I don't have any doubt of this, and I am very happy and impressed. But so I'm talking from the Peruvian perspective, which might be similar to the Ecuadorian perspective, the Bolivian perspective, the Chilean perspective, the Argentinian perspective, in which getting you know, interest from the academic institutions for doing pedagogical kind of work it's very difficult, very difficult. So in the end, you do these things over the weekends. That's what you do. You know, after teaching 20 hours per week, then the weekend, instead of spending time with your little daughter, you write you know, materials to teach how to write in Isconawa other kids. That's the reality. But you are not able to use your university time, your 40 hours of time, the 40 hours for which you are paid to produce community-based materials. So it's very difficult, not impossible. I shouldn't say, and things are improving also here in Peru, but very little. So still the situation is not equivalent. And some people in the chat also mentioned, you know, National Science Foundation and other sources of funding. And you know, you can just compare how much money you can get for a documentation project and how much money you can get for a revitalization project. So we are talking about $200,000 for documentation and $2,000 for revitalization. This is more or less the situation. So if you want to devote yourself to revitalization, you need to be retired, extremely rich, I don't know. But it's very difficult to or work for an NGO, you know, like leaving the academia and getting money from somewhere else. But at least in Peru, it's very difficult to convince people in charge of the university, in charge of the research grants, to tell them, you know, this is also important. And actually it's scientifically important because you can also write scientific papers about the processes, and you might get those papers published in other in journals related to those topics. But if you frame your project from the perspective of revitalization, then you won't get anything. If you frame your project from the perspective of documentation or even description, then you will get the money, and you might include a little bit of your funding in your budget to conduct some sort of community-based activities. At least this is how I feel it. Maybe, of course, in other countries like Canada, the situation is different, but here is not like that.
Yeah. Thank you, Roberto. And do we have time to get one more question? Because there's one that I would like to ask. I mean, that one of the question one of the panelists, not the panelists, one of the attendees has asked. Hello, Anne. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and ask anyway. So this comes from someone named Paula, says, hello, greetings from the north of South America. I would like to ask a hands-on question regarding the documentation work itself. What are some ethical considerations you could give to researchers in training who are just starting to work with Indigenous languages documentation, but are not closely linked to those communities nor have an Indigenous background? That is, how can white or mestizos researchers work with the community and avoid endorsing one-way documentation processes? And we only have about 5 minutes left, so if anyone wants to try and answer this quickly. Anyone?
I'll throw in a few things. So I would say, if you can, one thing to do might be to go to a future COLANG, the Institute for Collaborative Language Research, and which is an opportunity to, like, there's a lot of workshops and things that where you take the opportunity to learn more and newer ethical ways of doing research in language communities and language documentation or revitalization in language communities. Another thing, let's see here. I think I'll stop with that and see if other panelists have something to say.
Okay, great. Thanks, Susan.
Can I make a comment on that, Todd?
Sure, go ahead. Yeah, please.
I would like to really recommend that people look at Lee Stobrin's work that deals with, basically just deals with the question that there's a huge range of variation across communities and that there's no single recipe for ethical and engaged collaborative work, that it really depends on the community. And the point that Lise brings out in her work, including a paper published in Language a few years ago, is that the really important starting point, I think whether you're a community member or not, is to be a kind of participant observer for a while and have a sort of ethnographic framework where you think about what is important to people in this community. What do they want? What's the diversity of opinions? What are ways that we can engage collaboratively that make sense within this cultural context, within this community perspective or perspectives, rather than just assuming that there's one recipe that might have been formulated in one part of the world and isn't necessarily all that appropriate in other parts of the world or transferred from one community to the other. So I would put in a plug for reading Lisa's work about that.
Yes, the key word is trust. And trust is something that you develop with time. And of course, having the chance of going to a community, not for scientific reasons, just for be there and see and learn. And I totally agree. So then you will see how to keep that trust. And while trust is kept, you won't have any kind of ethical problem or situation.
Okay, thank you, Roberto. Thank you, everyone. We've got 2 minutes left, and I think, unfortunately, the time has gone by quickly, and we didn't have, this is always a problem. You think you'll have time to address all the questions and comments, but didn't quite work out that way.
Hey, Todd.
However, as I mentioned before, yeah, go ahead.
Maybe we can just address with one word each. What would you suggest? What would you advise graduate students who want to go into revitalization projects, who want to follow your footsteps? Just one word each, and then we can close. Thanks.
I have one sentence. Volunteer and listen at like a breath of life or something like that, where graduate students and faculty are sought out to be assistants to language communities.
Patty, Balam, Roberto, Birgit, anyone want to add?
Okay, I can say something. I think one, I guess the idea is that we have to also understand the community where we are going, because at least in Mexico and Guatemala, and I think most part of South America, we do not often work with a community as a unit, as a whole. We always work with small groups of people, maybe family members, an organization, a group of teachers. So there is always the point where you start working with a very small group of people and not the whole community. And that's where, I mean, at least in my experience, that's the way it works. I work with my family, basically. I started working with my family, and I am a speaker, and I am a member of a community, but that doesn't mean that everyone will agree with you. So there is this diverse idea of the language and how it should be worked on and all of those things. So you always start working with a small group of people that, I mean, someone said trust. Basically, you create a sort of relationship, and then there you take the interest of that group of people, and then maybe you may be able to expand it, or maybe not, depending on how things developed. And basically, you sort of have to listen to how different organizations work and interact with each other. And sometimes you get into the wrong side of problems in the community, where people will not agree with a group that you chose, then sort of it's going to be difficult. So there are things that sort of basically my idea is that, okay, you work with a group of people. It's the idea, you have to look for a group of people, and often maybe an organization or a family, and that's sort of the best way to go and expand from there.
Thanks, Palam. Patty, Birgit, or Roberto, or any final words?
Well, just assuming that in the next years, you will be doing a lot of non-linguistic work. You will spend your time doing things that are not linguistics, that are social work, that are, you know, efforts for building trust relations with people. So, and remembering that this time is not lost time. You are not losing anything. You are building something. That's very important, at least in my experience. I am aware that I could have been a better linguist if I would have just read grammars and write academic work. But at least I know that I have a family, a kind of family with the Cacataibo and the Conagua, that they like me and they trust me. And this is something that it's much better than publishing in language or in science or whatever. So it's take that into consideration, that you will be doing things that will enrich you as a human being and not only as a professional linguist. That will be my advice.
Okay, thank you. It's a little bit after 1 p.m. now in the East Coast. So we've gone over a little bit. Someone had asked in the chat if recording will be made available to everyone, and the answer is yes. We'll send you a link in the next day or two. And we'll also go through all the questions and comments in the chat, and we will endeavor to get back to each and every one of you who asked a question or needs more clarification, or either from me or from Birgit or Anne, but we'll try to make sure that everyone's question is responded to. And again, thank you for everyone who registered, and thank you even more so for everyone who attended today and for getting involved. And I hope it was useful and interesting for everyone, and maybe we'll do it again someday. You know, maybe we'll schedule a little more time, an hour and a half or something, because it's a topic that a lot of people have a lot of opinions on, and one session is probably not going to cover everything. So again, on behalf of the Gruyter, Boston-based team, thank you very much. And if anyone else wants to say any final words, please do so now.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Nice to see you all and reading you all.
Great, thank you.